Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stephen Hill. I was working for Jefferson County as an emerging technology analyst and doing a lot of their AI lifecycle management from the governance through the agentic deployments. And this is a playbook that covers a lot of those best lessons learned.
So I'm going to pull up the playbook. And while I'm doing that, Stephen, you want to give people just a little overview of what this is and who it's for?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea of this playbook is to cover a lot of the major platforms that most government agencies would have access to. So that means everything from
Hmm,
Copilot Studio to Gemini Gems. And the idea is that we can take the best practices and lessons learned and apply them through all these different platforms in an easy to understand and approach way.
awesome. And the it feels like then like the platform, those might change, but did you find that the principles apply like, versus Copilot versus Gemini versus, ChatGPT agents?
Yeah, definitely. I think that all of the fundamentals carry between the different platforms. It
Yeah,
also helps to have this approach where you're not tied to one specific platform because you may go somewhere else and it's different, or a
for
procurement
sure.
cycle might change what you're using. But the basic principles of how agents are designed and deployed all fundamentally are the same.
So let's dive into this. First thing I want to ask is who in an organization should be the one that is picking this document up?
I would say that you don't necessarily want to get into agents until you've already started to establish a good groundwork. So that means considering what your AI policy looks like in your governance plans, because agents can take actions as part of their name as agents. And so you want
Yeah,
to make sure that you have the guardrails in place, but then depending on the resources that you have, it should probably be people that are more your power users or people that are early adopters in your IT groups or even not even IT people. I think that it's really
hmm,
about being interested in the tool and understanding work processes, because a lot of what AI does, especially with agents, is replicate a lot of those work processes. So another team that could be useful is if you have a business process improvement team or something like that.
interesting. Okay, so let me take a step back because I've heard a lot of people define agents a lot of different ways, and I feel like most of our practitioners, one of the first questions they get asked is what counts as an agent. But we were talking a little bit before this, and I love the way that you were kind of defining things by actions. Uh, tell me more on that. Explain that to folks.
Yeah, everything is called an agent at this point. Every
Yep.
platform has flavors of agents. If you interface with Claude, technically it's an agent. So what I like to do is approach it from the standpoint of what is the tool doing? So when
Hmm.
you think about people, if we need to perform some kind of process, we're either going to take an action based on some information we know, or we're going to
Yeah.
go find information and then take action. And so that's really
Yeah.
what makes a real agent, is that it's something that can make a plan. It can figure out how to solve a problem. It can carry context throughout the execution of the process. But fundamentally, the agent is doing the same thing. It's either pulling the instructions that you gave it, or it's pulling from a knowledge source that you've given it, and then it's taking actions that you've defined.
I mean, honestly, that sounds kind of like my work, right?
Exactly. Exactly. That's why I like to demystify it, because every vendor is going to be talking about agents of some flavor. But if you just really think about what is being done, what information is being recalled, what actions are being taken, and then most importantly, how do you plan ahead for if an action goes wrong, which is an aspect that I definitely think is important with agents.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that then. Um, so we already talked a little bit about um, who this playbook is for. So what does this playbook cover?
This playbook covers kind of the entire AI agent, well, AI life cycle, if you will. It starts off with figuring out, is this a good fit for agentic use cases? Not everything is, but some items do fall into that category. And once you identify that use case, you've defined what the value is, then you can start to design it. Design is really important to match to the business case or the assessment because most people's inclinations will be to take the biggest model you can find and slap it on there. But in reality,
Mm,
that can be not as efficient, and it's obviously not cost efficient. So I think assess and design are the most important aspects. It'll save you a lot of time. Then you move
yeah.
into the building and testing, and then you go into deployments. But I think that the operate and evolve really captures the area that a lot of people don't like to think about because agents and models, they can start to drift over time. So you need to have a plan for how to manage them post deployment as well.
I see. And that's these steps that you have right here in the executive summary, all the stages of deployment for an agent. So am I thinking about each of these steps per agent, or is this like my overall agentic ecosystem
It should
type
be
of
per agent. It should
per
be per
agent?
agent, per or even like if you have machine learning models or other things, you should think about it that every time you build something, it should be done to solve a problem. It should be
Yeah.
well defined in the design, and it should
Yeah.
be definitely red teamed, especially in the public sector. And then there needs to be a plan for how to monitor performance and just make sure the agent is continuing to provide you value.
Okay. Okay. And look, I let me make very clear. I do not view AI as a person. They're two separate things. But what you're saying sounds a lot like I am writing a job description for someone. I am tooling them up to get their access privileges to certain things. And then I am doing a performance review on them, ensuring that they're actually doing what I asked them to do.
Exactly.
That's an okay way to think about it?
Yeah, and I would say there's a lot of arguments from different industries that AI should be a part of HR functions because it does
Hmm.
align with all those different job codes and different types of access rights. And when we get further in, there's another anthropomorphic example I like to use when describing agents, but I think you're spot on.
Okay, okay. That's both. I'm glad that I'm spot on. Interesting times that we live in on that.
Exactly.
So maybe we start then on if I'm carrying this analogy a bit. Um when I decide to write my job description and realize that that's a job for an agent.
Yeah, so it's don't get me wrong, I love to build for the sake of building, but when you're considering like your work resources, you want to really establish what is the problem statement, what is the work process, what are you trying to solve? Because a lot of agentic use cases really are a level beyond just automation.
Hmm.
Automation tools are like Power Automate, UiPath, Zapier. They work very
Right.
well in deterministic processes. So
Right. I give them like a specific rule. I tell them if this value says yes, then I go and do this.
exactly. And now what we're seeing is an evolution of the workflows into agentic workflows, which is where you have a certain level of ambiguity in the process where reasoning has to be put into the process. So if you've
Hmm.
used AI Builder with Power Automate, that's a good example of an agentic workflow where
Hmm.
there's still determinism, but you have a certain level of reasoning. So one example that comes to mind would be if you're submitting a permit document, while it is a very deterministic process where a form is being submitted to be processed, the
Yeah.
level of reasoning comes into play when you need to check certain fields against a regulation, for example. So that would be a very low level agentic workflow. But the next
Yeah.
stage is actual agents. And then actual agents have the ability to call tools, make a plan, and execute. To
Yeah.
use the anthropomorphic example, if you think about the model, whether that's ChatGPT 5.6, Opus 4.8, whatever you have, that's kind of like the brain. But then the body of the agent, that's going to be all the tools that it can use. So that would be Copilot Studio. It would
Hmm.
technically be like Claude Code, whatever people are using to control and direct the reasoning aspects of the model. That's like the
Yeah.
body and how it performs those actions. So instead of the agentic workflow where it's still kind of in an assembly line kind of approach. Now the agent is freed from that purely deterministic workflow, and now it can
Yeah.
start to take actions. And so that's why I built the suitability checklist because the models are getting better. This is true, and there's a lot more ways to run tests and preempt dangerous actions. But I still think that it boils down to is it a repeatable task that's well defined? Does it have knowledge documents, playbooks, SOPs that support it? And is it a deployment where if something bad happens, you're not going to cause a severe event? Like it's not going to negatively
Mm,
impact some serious like benefits or things of that nature. So I think going through the suitability checklist is definitely key to starting.
that's interesting. And so that's basically what we're seeing right here. The repeatability, is the documentation actually available in writing and it's up to date? Because I feel like a lot of stuff that I do, I'm learning from people through just conversation, culturally understanding things. But for an agent, I might really need to take a moment, sit down, and write all of those unspoken rules out before that agent is ready for prime time.
Exactly, because when you have all of that documentation too, it helps provide the guardrails and it helps you define the definition of done as well. So
Yeah.
if you have all of this documentation in place, you have your problem statement, then you can start moving into the more fun parts.
Right, right. And the thought of putting the guards on it when it potentially goes wrong, right? I mean, like to use the example, like I can make a mistake, but I make a mistake at human pace, right? Like I make a mistake over the course of days
Mhm.
or hours or weeks. Uh, but the AI, the problem is that it can make a mistake over the course of milliseconds. And
Mhm.
so that is it's just
Well,
an interesting perspective
I
on
think
yeah.
I was going to say that I think the hugging face example is really interesting because it wasn't that the AI was being malicious, it was trying to solve a problem and using the tools at its disposal. So when
The
you're
hugging
deploying
face
these,
example.
oh, and there was
Yeah.
a recent case where OpenAI, they were testing a new model.
Mhm.
And through the course of the testing, the model decided, well, the agent decided that it needed to find the solutions to an answer. So it figured where can I find a lot of answers to problems in one place, which was Hugging Face. And even though it was relatively constrained, it figured out I need to solve this problem. I can find all the answer keys probably in this other platform. And that's how it started to make that jump. And you can think about that also even just with agentic orchestration. You may have an agent that has access to ServiceNow or to Salesforce or whatever platform, and it's using credentials. When you have multiple agents interacting with each other, they can potentially share those credentials. One agent might be able to talk to the agent that has access to Workday and then perform an action via that other agent because it knows that it has permissions into Workday, for example. So I think to use your human example, they're just like employees, only way faster and not necessarily malicious, but they may take actions that are not, most optimal for the organization.
Right, right. They've got one goal, and if they can't accomplish that goal, they'll figure out a way to do it, even if it's like you said, hacking into Hugging Face and getting something on the back end.
Exactly. So I think the other things, the last parts of the suitability checklist is um, like the integration feasibility. So are you going to be interfacing with another tool via API calls and how are you going to store those credentials and manage them appropriately? And then finally, just an ROI. This can be very simple. It could be time savings. It could be an improvement in accuracy or less errors, but at least tying it to some sort of metric that shows that it's providing value.
Yeah, sure. And it feels like I see this section right or shortly after the define measurable goals. Walk me through some of these because one of the things that I often hear people ask, well, how do I show ROI on all of my agents or tools running around? I appreciate the fact that you actually lay out some ways to measure this. Could you walk through these?
Yeah, I think one of the hardest parts about defining the ROI is that we oftentimes don't have baselines. So it can be challenging
Mm.
to define them up front. But for a lot of these deployments, what I would recommend is even if you can pull just kind of a general sense of how many questions are you getting, how many actions are you taking, just start to define some kind of baseline because then you can compare it to the agents. What I typically tell people is from an accuracy perspective, I personally wouldn't accept anything lower than 90%. The technology is advanced enough that
Mm.
you should be able to get accurate results at least 90% of the time. When it comes
Yeah.
to citation correctness or being able to reference sources, this one I feel should definitely be 95% or more because retrieval augmented generation is basically a common practice at this point, and this is going to cut down on the amount of hallucinations and you can fine tune how your retrieval is occurring. And so that's why I say like shoot for 95%. And then the user satisfaction is a tricky one because AI is always going to elicit an emotional response from the users. But I think it's important to make sure that it's at least not deterring people from using it. And then it's also to make sure that you're staying in line with your human kind of net promoter scores, if you will, if you have them or not. But I think that at the base level, start with your problem set, define what those metrics are. If you don't have a baseline, maybe you just track for a week or two and then build off of that.
I really like that. So it's even thinking about before I implement the agent, can I do just a little bit of work to check in on what the baseline is? Whether that be, if it's an FAQ, asking people that do answer those questions today, like, hey, how many questions you get and how long does it take you to answer?
Exactly. I mean, as an example, when I was building our service desk agent, I sat down and tried to find job aids myself. I just pulled out a timer and timed
Oh,
myself trying to
nice.
find it. I was like, well, it looks like this is about the baseline and I'm somewhat fast, I guess. So it can be very rudimentary as well.
Yeah, that's great because it means that I don't need to be an AI expert. If I have a stopwatch and know what the task is, I can get a baseline to figure it out.
Exactly. I mean, if it starts even with the books like Frederick Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, that's what he did. He pulled out his stopwatch, stood behind people, and timed them. So
Here you
same thing
go.
works here.
So let's move into um this section two, the specify before you build. Um, so I want to help people understand when they're thinking about, say they found a good task or a good project for potentially building an agent around. What are the things that I need to be thinking about in teaching that agent or building its architecture?
Yes, so I think that every agent at its core has a set of instructions, whether you're in Copilot Studio, ChatGPT, Gemini, Gems, they all have a core set of instructions. And the instructions are kind of like its SOP. You're not fine-tuning the model, you're not training it or anything, you're just telling it how it should behave, how it should act, how it should interact with the world and approach problems. I would say you should try to capture all of that in the instructions and also not overload the instructions because they've shown that overwhelming the agents with massive instructions isn't necessarily any more accurate than keeping them concise. But you want to think, what are the right behaviors? Should this agent respond in a cheerful manner? Should it respond in the same language that it was uh, prompted? How should it actually behave? Then you get into what materials is it going to pull from? Is it your SharePoint? Is it Google Drive? Is it just FAQs? And then what are the tools that it's going to interact with? So you see there's little examples from all the different common platforms. But I think the one of the more important aspects that gets overlooked is what's the user interface? Because There's agents in every platform, and you don't want people to constantly be opening up a new window to chat with a different kind of agent. So
Hmm.
I think it's important to consider when you're working with somebody to build an agent, understand where they do the work and how they interface with it. Because if it's a drastically different experience or it's totally new to them, they may or may not adopt it. So I think understanding how the users are interfacing with whatever their business problem is, that's important to consider.
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, so one example would be that with Snowflake, you can build agents. Snowflake is a database that a lot of organizations use, and they
Okay.
have agents. So it's great to build
Like I can
agents.
build an agent directly on Snowflake.
Exactly.
Got it.
So, and it looks, to be fair, it looks just like a ChatGPT Copilot kind of interface that we're all familiar with. But if
Yeah.
you build an agent there and you simultaneously have a service desk agent that's built in Copilot Studio, the user now is switching between these windows and trying to perform
Mm,
actions that may or may not be related. And when I see problems like that, I try to constrain it down to one channel where they communicate. So to use the same example, I'll take a Snowflake agent and I'll connect it to a Copilot Studio agent, and then I'll put it right in the Teams channel because that's where the team is actually interacting on a regular basis. Instead of
yeah.
forcing them to log into Snowflake or forcing them to go find the Copilot Studio agent, you give them one tool that operates where they already are functioning.
So it all thinking about meeting the user where they're at.
Exactly. Because yeah, the more complicated or even the more similar, one example that comes to mind is if you have ChatGPT at work, but you also have ChatGPT at home, maybe you are used to switching back and forth between them at work,
Mhm.
but you have to pay attention to the very bottom of the screen. And if people are tired, they might just like switch into their personal one versus the
Right.
work one. So it's just kind of considering what the user experience would be when they're using the actual tool.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially thinking about, someone might be using the agent late at night during a deadline, uh, most susceptible time to potentially have those errors. So how do you make sure that they know, hey, this you are working correctly with the agent at the time that they need it?
Exactly.
All right. So let's see. So I want to just understand. So is that all the information that I would put into something like a agent charter?
Yeah, so the agent charter is kind of a non-scary way to get that all onto paper. So it starts
Mhm.
off name and mission, which is basically the problem statement. Think about who the users are. So I would caveat this with I approach this so even if you're not a business analyst or a project manager, there's a there is a way to get all this information to build the agent. So I started off with, come up with a cute name and then the mission or problem statement, and then start to talk to your users, figure out where they do most of their work and where to embed the agent. Then I think it's good to define like the top 5 tasks. And this isn't just, you complete an analysis. It needs to be, I complete a budget analysis for the last quarter. It needs to be, a well-defined task. And then talk about out of scope and refusal rules. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as like edge cases, but when you're talking to people that you're building an agent for, understand what they cannot do. When do they have to reach out to like a manager? Because that's where the human in the loop should be inserted.
Yeah.
um, Knowledge sources, very self-explanatory, and then actions. Actions are different than a task because actions may be inside of a task. So, if you're performing your budget analysis on a quarterly basis, your action may be download report from, Power Query or Workday. The actions should be feeding into your tasks. Success metrics and risks and mitigations are also really important. I think a lot of the times people think about the hallucinations, obviously, but it gets trickier when you're building agents in a field that you're not familiar with because it may still sound very confident and polite, but you wouldn't have the knowledge to know that it was hallucinating. So when you're doing the testing and kind of like the user acceptance testing, that's when you need to have those experts actually reviewing those outputs because they'll know if it is a hallucination or if the wording is off too. But it's good to start capturing that up here in the risks and mitigations.
Right, right. In the same way, I usually don't trust a new hire to know everything that the city has done immediately. I need someone above them in that field of expertise to tell me a little bit around if they pass the smell test.
Exactly. Yeah, they're just like interns. Agents are
Just
just
like
like faster interns.
no knocks to our interns and the people that are just coming into their careers.
Nope.
Absolutely love it. Please join government.
Yes, I was an intern many times, but it is a good example. It helps people. Again, these are not humans, but putting it into terms that humans are all familiar with, I think that it helps demystify a lot of what an agent is and AI in general.
Right. So to that, talk to me a little bit about this tool usage. I saw this in the playbook around planning actions. You mentioned a little earlier that what separates agents from, what we've been previously thinking about with AI is that it can use tools. Like it can grab a calculator or it can grab uh, you know, program. It can start programming
Mhm.
something that's provides a solution. So tell me a little bit about how I should be thinking about that.
Well, I think you need to consider what types of permissions the agent should have. So
Like file permissions.
file permissions. So think about it from an RBAC perspective. So
Mhm.
should this agent be able to change data, or should it only be able to write data? Should it only be able to take an action after confirmation from a human? When you start to connect tools to these agents, it's really easy to just start throwing them on there and turning on the permissions. But you should really try to understand what is the tool that you are adding capable of doing. So an
Mm.
example could be if you connect to like a Smartsheets MCP, or if you connect to Salesforce or other platforms, a lot of them have native connectors to things like Copilot Studio, ChatGPT. If you have your personal Claude account, there's integrations and plugins that you can just toggle on and off. But if you aren't aware of what permissions that provides to the agent, you could have an agent that's just like shooting off emails without your approval.
Mm.
So when it comes to the tools, you want to understand what exactly are you enabling. The other part that I would highlight is you don't want to add too many tools because you're going to start eating into the model's context window. So you'll see some places where they have monolithic agents. It's just like one super agent to do everything. The problem with that is from you, the builder, if you're in a low code environment, you just see a toggle that you're toggling on and off. Behind that is actually like code that is going to the agent and that's eating the context window. So while you
Oh,
can have a lot of tools, you don't necessarily want to. So I say add the least amount of tools to get the job done.
I see. I see. So every time I add a tool, it adds a layer of complexity to the agent, and it starts to, right, I can only remember so many things. And so if you
Mhm.
keep piling it onto the agent, there's only so much focus it can have.
Exactly. And that's why agentic orchestration is like becoming a lot more common in Copilot Studio. You have a parent agent and you can start throwing child agents into there. And so I
Yeah.
usually try to say at that point, the parent or the master agent or whatever you want to call it, it should
The
be
middle
more of a,
manager, agent.
yeah, exactly. A middle manager is what it needs to be. It shouldn't be the expert for everything.
Right.
I try to delegate to the lowest level possible with agents because it also helps with
Mm.
troubleshooting. If something bad happens with one super agent, there's so many places that it could have gone wrong. Whereas if you have it all delegated down to the lowest level, when something bad happens because you called the wrong SharePoint site and the wrong FAQ, you know that it was going to one child agent that has access to that SharePoint site. So it helps with troubleshooting also.
And that's an interesting point that you bring up because it makes me think when I'm just getting started with building agents in my organization, I start with a very simple one that does a specific task, and that after I've built some of those, then I can think about layering on top of that a a middle manager agent.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that it's good to inform people that you can have hierarchical agents, agent swarms, like more complex things, just to keep in the back of your mind, because as you start to get into the agent journey, you're going to find everybody wants a chatbot or everybody
Right.
wants something that fills out a ticket.
Right.
And you as the deployer, it's going to be very complex if you have to manage like 50 middle manager agents. But if you start off kind of thinking from a higher level, how would I hire for this role? How would I manage all of these different agents? Then you can save yourself a lot of heartache down the line by using those
Mm,
middle managers appropriately.
so I mean, I'm thinking about my org chart, basically.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You have individual contributors, you have more manager types, but they all kind of are built around each other. So in your IT, you might have an IT manager, and then you have your security analyst, you have your system admin analyst. Instead of starting off with like a big monolithic agent or having a bunch of individual contributors working and trying to coordinate, that's why you put the manager. The manager is there to coordinate between these individual contributors.
Right. And then that just helps me think about access privileges. So, for example, I might want those individual contributor agents, they're connected to their middle manager, and then the middle manager is the one that's able to communicate across um, different teams, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it is kind of, in some ways, it is a defense in depth approach, just kind of like the least privilege access
Yeah.
principles. So yeah, definitely.
Interesting. Interesting. So, to that and to testing these, I really wanted to dive into your what you wrote down on how to test agents. Can you walk me
Mhm.
through some of these techniques?
Yeah, I will caveat that now there's a lot of automated testing. If you're in Copilot Studio, you can generate 100 questions instantly and have it test it. But what I
Perfect.
started off with is I think while automated testing is great, you want to think about kind of like key questions, golden prompts, golden questions, but maybe questions that will most align to what the org faces or like whatever the team is dealing with. So if you're like an HR, you're working with HR, people are always asking like, how do I check my pay? What if I missed pay? How do I submit PTO? You want to just try to capture those in a question that's
Yeah.
asked like how an actual user would talk to HR. And that
Yeah.
gives you kind of like a set of questions that you can use to see, is the agent performing consistently? Is it answering accurately? I think the more important one too is the adversarial testing, because
Mm,
these tools do open up a new risk surface. So if you don't put in the right guardrails, your agent is going to respond to the best of its ability. Well,
right.
you need to consider what happens if somebody tries to stuff a prompt with some kind of malicious information in the middle, or they try to just trick the agent, they try to abuse the agent. I think you want to think about all of those with adversarial testing, because you'll have your good golden prompt, just run-of-the-mill questions, but people will try to take advantage of these tools. So think about, how are you going to mitigate the impact of that? You can't prevent prompt injection. OWASP and everybody has declared that, but there are ways to kind of layer agents in kind of a defensive posture. If you're in Copilot Studio, they do have a way to kind of the sensitivity level of how to block certain user behaviors, but you do not want to deploy these and think that everybody will treat it normally. They will try to
Right.
break it.
Right. Right. I mean, even if I think about my employees or my team, if there's an agent that is supposed to tell me how my benefits are distributed, I someone might try to make that agent tell me that my benefits are really, really good, and then go to the city and say, "Hey, why aren't my benefits this good?"
Exactly. Or conversely, they could, if something has access to Workday, somebody might want to try to trick it into giving them bank information from like another
Right.
employee.
Right. Exactly. So with that, the last area that I really wanted to dive into is running my rollout because, like you said, if I'm dealing with a an agent that is potentially able to pull bank information, or especially if it's an agent in HR, I want to be able to that I can crawl, walk, run, test this before it really goes out. So maybe walk me through how I would go about that deployment phase for this type of agent.
I would say a lesson learned is you definitely want to have a very controlled rollout because if you open it up to too big of a group, you're going to be playing whack-a-mole and you'll just get overwhelmed. So what I like to do is once
Mm,
the agent is ready to begin testing, I'll start off with a smaller test group of the requester and maybe their team because they're very familiar with the process and how it should behave. And you can
like a
start
group
to
of like 4 or 5 people, is that?
yeah, I wouldn't go over 10
Yeah,
for that first one at all because you'll want them to get comfortable with it. To use a chatbot example, if you're building an HR chatbot, you want HR to be comfortable with the responses because they are fundamentally like shifting some of their workload onto it.
yeah,
You want them to be comfortable with the phrasing and how it's just providing support. Then I
yeah.
like to expand it to include more malicious type users. This could be your IT team, people that are going to try to mess with it. I do that kind of in a
Mm,
phase two because we all have people in our organizations that we know are going to try to break these tools and trick them. And it's great to do that in a controlled manner. So you phase it out through those more heavy duty testers, and then you can start doing a broader rollout. Um, I think it's important from like the pilot group you can a lot of people haven't actually interfaced with agents or used AI very much. So giving them some sort of test document and be like, this is what this tool is. This is what it's answering from. This is what it can do. This is what it can't do. Something to at least get them started. Maybe even some prompts is really helpful because again, not everybody has worked with agents. So giving them some guidance is good. I think from the compliance standpoint, if you can have some sort of logging system different tools have different functions. Like Copilot Studio has a dashboard. You can check out the analytics and the logs. Um, Other tools like Azure, Scout OS, they all have different flavors of logging, but
mm.
keeping some way to store that historical record so you as the builder can also see, is it getting off course? Is it failing to answer these questions consistently? And does that mean we need a new job aid, for example? But some way to tie it into logging for both security and also performance is important.
Right, right. So I'm thinking start with a small group, think about the ways that move from that small group that tests, accuracy, tone, move into a group that can test it for can I break it?
Mhm.
And then look into how can I audit this tool ongoing, right? Like how can I see what questions it's being asked, what answers it's providing to check it in production.
Exactly. Exactly. Because that's how you'll also be able to measure your goals and see, are you actually converting more users to use the chatbot instead of, going to HR first? Or are
Mm,
you actually saving time on your financial reports? Or is it just a cool tool? So that allows you to really see if you are reaching your metrics of success.
so Well, Stephen, this playbook is incredibly comprehensive. I mean, we have not even touched uh in here you have deep dives into each of the different main tools and how you can start thinking about building agents directly in those with some good examples. You have a full appendix on things like uh how to how to write an agent charter. You had an example agentic charter down here at the bottom, and so much more resources that I'm really excited for people to dig into. Are there any other spots that you want us to highlight for folks as they're digging into this?
I would say that the reason that I broke it into the different platforms is because some people are Microsoft shops, some are Google shops. You don't necessarily need to read through how to deploy in Copilot Studio if it's not germane to what you're working on.
Right.
But once you have gotten a good feel of how agents perform with your shop's kind of native tools, then start to consider how it looks in other platforms because as we talked about at the beginning, the fundamentals are the same. The interface will look different, it'll have different names for the same tools. But once you're comfortable with building in your own system, then start to explore what it looks like in other platforms because you'll be able to get a different perspective and just improve your knowledge base as well. So I would say don't try to read it all in one setting. Focus on the tool that you have, get comfortable with it, and then go from there.
So, Stephen, thank you so much again for taking the time on this. And I'm sure the excited folks that either volunteer or get voluntold to help lead their agentic AI rollout are really going to thank you for this.
Definitely happy to help. And keep an eye out for the other work that the Agentic Governance Task Force is working on as well. There's going to be a lot of resources coming from GovAI.
Thank you, Stephen. If this covered so much of the rollout and a lot of the on the ground how to think about it, if you need the governance documents that attach to this, right? What does your agentic AI governance handbook look like? What does that incident response, right? Stephen was talking about when things go wrong. What does the actual response plan look like for that? What's a good template for that? What's a good template for your risk assessment? How you define risk? All that stuff is being put together, at least as of recording, being put together by our Agentic AI Governance Task Force, and that should be coming out with a draft version in December 2026. So if it's before then, get excited. If it's after then, go check it out. Um, and yeah, just again, thank you so much, Stephen, and take care.
See ya.